I'm delighted today to be joined by Molly Jane Zuckerman, Content Manager at CoinMarketCap, and June Wong, an independent journalist and researcher, and two board members of the newly established Association of Cryptocurrency Journalists and Researchers. Molly Jane and June, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
That's great to have you. So the ACJR is a new professional body that recognizes the best in journalism and research on cryptocurrencies and blockchains. So June, I understand that the ACJR has an extensive journalist representation across most major publications in the crypto trade space, as well as mainstream media. How did the formation of this body come about, and who are the founding members of your board, and why was it important to have this cross-industry representation?
Yeah, we have got a great group of founders. We have 10 founding members, and we've drawn from really the ranks of the most experienced journalists in the space. So folks like Laura Shin, who does the Unchained podcast, and before that was at Forbes, has been reporting on the space for a long time. Michael Del Castillo, who used to be at CoinDesk and is now at Forbes. Josh Quittner, who, reported on Web 1.0 and now is doing the same with Web 3.0 at Decrypt, which he co-founded. Camilla Russo, Pete Rizzo, lots of familiar names from anybody who's been following the space for some time. So we got this great group together, and many of us have sort of been in the trenches, metaphorically, over the years, reporting on this space, and are sort of very well aware of the challenges. And we thought, let's get together. The space has become so big and so complicated, and it does look like there's a pickup in interest and attention, in price, of course. So let's get together before the next sort of cycle happens and we get plunged into this. We saw this in 2017, we saw this in 2013, where you get this vortex of just interest, right? Everybody wants to find out what's happening with the price of Bitcoin or the price of whatever coin. And you end up quite often with people who don't really know the space, trying to cover the space very quickly. And as a result, you end up with a lot of confused or sort of, conflicted information. And so our thought was, a few of us ended up with a bit of time on our hands, and we thought this was just a very opportune moment to form a body that hopefully can serve as a resource both inside and outside the industry.
Fantastic. There's a number of things that you just touched on that I definitely wanted to dig into. So top line, Molly, the ACJR believes that free markets are inextricably linked to the freedom of information. So how does this feed into your overall mission for the organization? And ultimately, what is the ACJR trying to achieve? What's your goal here?
I think that our main goal is something that I brought up at one of our first meetings when we were still, in the founding stages. And then that is just that crypto journalism is journalism. And that distinguishing it in some ways is a way to look down on it or to not consider it to be the highest standards of journalism. And so in that sense, the ACJR exists in order to show people that crypto journalists not only do the same types of work that other journalists do, but that they are also obviously able to do amazing pieces, amazing investigations, amazing stories, amazing profiles, et cetera. And so I think that the quotation from, I think it's our bylaws on our website about our mission being to support the freedom of information, which is, like you said, linked to the freedom of markets, is just the idea of freedom of speech at the heart. And that's what all journalists believe in, is that no one should be restricted from writing about the truth.
Indeed. Indeed. So June, one of the goals is to promote the excellence in journalism and research, as well as supporting colleagues in the field. So, potentially that cross-pollination of information, and educating the industry on best practices. So, going back to what Molly has said, I think that there has been maybe stigma is a strong word, but this idea that, crypto journalists don't research a story in the same way that maybe mainstream press do, or, that they're not fact checking, or, that they're not reaching out for comment from all sides. I know that to be untrue. My experience in the industry has reflected all of those things happening. So why is this important to establish, some kind of best practice for the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes both ways, right? So I think on one hand, as journalists in the industry, we've come across a lot of misconceptions about how the media works from companies and people in the industry, right? So people have no idea how newsrooms work. They don't have a good sense of the conventions of news gathering and reporting. So that's one thing, is for us to really try and educate folks in the industry about the conventions that the journalism profession uses, right? And of course, I think lots of people in this industry then say, well, those are not good conventions. We don't like those conventions. That may be so, but let's start from a common starting point of what even are those conventions. So that's one thing, the internal side. And then I think the sort of the external side is really talking to journalists who don't cover crypto day to day, and sort of explaining, some of the unique challenges in this field. Reporting on, for example, protocol development in Bitcoin or Ethereum is a very different task from reporting on, earnings calls from a large technology company like Apple or Google or something like that. There is no CEO, there is no investor relations office, there are no splashy, launch days to attend. We're dealing with pseudonymous and sometimes anonymous individuals who have gone to great lengths not to reveal their identities. And they're operating in a kind of very emergent and fluid framework to make changes to this global protocol. And so the sort of the reporting challenges that you face covering this space are quite large, and in many cases, I think, unique compared to conventional methods of reporting in business journalism, in technology journalism, and even to some extent, you might think of things like political journalism, right? Because I think cryptocurrencies have increasingly, the social layer has become increasingly important to understand why some protocols change the way they do. So that's the external facing part, is really to communicate to the journalism industry at large, like why we think cryptocurrency reporting is unique, why it's interesting from a sort of journalistic point of view, and why we think there's some really great work that people are doing in this space.
Yeah, for sure. So I think two things that you brought up there. One I'll bring up in a moment, but the first was, let's take, the sushi saga, for example. Who are you supposed to call at Sushi Swap to get a quote for what's actually going on? When, at the time when, there was, what some might have thought was a rug pull. Nobody knew who was kind of running that protocol, right? So it's a different type of investigative journalism that needs to be undertaken to try and get to what the story is whilst it's happening. And I think that's a big challenge for you guys, having to interpret what's true in real time. I think that is sufficiently differentiated from many other industries where you kind of have a trajectory development of a story over some time. I had lunch with someone yesterday, actually, who's really interested in Bitcoin. And we really went around the houses for quite a while as I was, he was asking questions and I was trying to explain in lay terms exactly, we wanted to know, where does the Bitcoin blockchain sit? Right. So like, where is it housed? What address do I go to? If anybody can view it, what www. do I go to see it? And how do people access it to update it? And it was quite a difficult conversation, and I felt a bit stupid because this is what I do for a living, and I was having a really, really difficult time explaining this in a way that he understood. So that's a challenge for me. This guy was a smart guy, and this went on for some time. So I think the challenge of communicating some of the technical aspects, especially of digital assets, and also the overall value of crypto in general to both, the crypto curious or crypto newbies, is pretty essential for getting new people to adopt and to get into the space. And it's also incredibly important to ensure that regulators implement policies that are actually fit for purpose. And they can't do that if they don't really understand the space and some of the technical nuances. So, Molly, I know one of your goals is to help journalists better explain the field to those that are learning about it. How can we do this better? What's lacking today that we can improve?
So there's several things that we have in the pipeline, and June, you can stop me if these are, private things, but I think that they're all in the, online public Google Docs, is that we want to experiment with creating working groups in the future so that the community itself can actually build potential guides to help people. I mean, one of the most basic things that was brought up the day that our Telegram group launched was, should you capitalize Bitcoin ever? Why, when, and why not? And so one idea is, to have a community meetup and to create a capitalization guide. But then there's something that could be a little bit more in depth. Like we could experiment by using Gitcoin to propose that the community creates a guide to reporting on Ethereum. Because like you already talked about, you can sit in on an Ethereum developer call. They're on YouTube, they're 3 hours long. I used to have to listen to them all the time when I worked at Cointelegraph. And you have to understand what is the newsworthy part of those. And maybe there won't be one. It's a lot different than what I think a lot of people are used to. So with the ACJR, we're very interested in kind of grappling with these ideas and thinking about ways that we can use the community to also create guides and work with them. I mean, one thing we already started is our webinar series. We've had 2. The first one was with Josh Quittner talking about reporting on Web 1.0 versus 3.0. And the second one was with Lee Quen and Cami Russo about building an audience. So, we're just really hoping for a lot of member participation when we open up membership and just a lot of community involvement in general.
Great. So one of the things I wanted to circle back to, June, you mentioned, we're much further down the road in maturity of the space. And I think that that's absolutely reflective, and also the journalistic quality of the stories that we see today versus 3 years ago, 5 years ago, for sure. But we're also seeing, as with crypto, things have always changed exponentially, in real time. And so as we kind of get to grips with the current technology that we have, as soon as we kind of get our arms around that, something changes. And I think, the explosion of DeFi over the last, 6 to 8 months, and all of the world and wonderful things that have come out of that, almost seems to be creating these niches. And Molly, you mentioned, being on an Ethereum protocol call, with developers is pretty different than potentially, looking at something around, market rallies, for example. So I'll pose this to you both. Do you see the industry developing these, particular function or property type niches across the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll jump in here first. I think you do see specialization across beats, and it's something you would expect, right? If an industry is maturing, so you might think about, let's say financial reporting. Or in fact, business reporting. Financial reporting is a subset of business reporting, right? And then within finance, you might have reporters who cover FX trading. Other people might cover certain companies, and yet other people might cover, structured credit products or something like that. And so, that's something that you definitely see in sort of mainstream journalism, and it really happens if that area of coverage is maturing. If there's more attention, there's more money in it, then there's a reason for people to specialize. So I think with crypto, it's basically the same thing. As it grows bigger, And if there's interest, right? If there's demand, then you will see people specializing. And I think you see great examples. One great example is Nick Day at CoinDesk. He's really made a name for himself as somebody who very closely covers U.S. Regulations and
Yeah.
policy in very minute detail. He really knows his way around those databases. He knows his way around the legislation,
Hmm.
and he knows the main players, right? So he's
Hmm.
become like that kind of a reporter.
Hmm.
And I think as crypto matures, you certainly will see people specializing that way, and you might even see publications pop up that focus on those niches, right?
So Molly, do you think that as that matures and people have more niches, to use June's word, does that then give us, as the community and the regulators and everybody interested in the space, a better idea of, if somebody's reporting on a story, that they're a subject matter expert, and if somebody else is reporting on a story, then potentially they're not the authority figure? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to. So if I read something in the Wall Street Journal or the FT, from a reporter that I know, is well versed in the topic that they're talking about, versus somebody else at a different publication, weight and credibility is given to this. And I think so far, you as a journalistic community have been kind of spread thin across everything that happens in crypto. So I just wonder if that's something, as the industry matures, that it will give the journalist community an opportunity to really hone their craft in specific segments of the space.
I definitely think that's true. I think that the DeFi wave, summer wave, has been a really good example of that, because
Mm.
as you talked about before, covering DeFi protocols is incredibly unique and difficult in its own way.
Mm.
And I think that, for example, I'm going to forget his last name, but Cooper, I think Cooper Turley, who writes for the Defiant, along with other things, to me, he is the DeFi expert. He's able to write in this really accessible way for this newsletter that I'm able to understand everything about DeFi. When I see a DeFi story from a different writer, I always wonder, what would Cooper have said? How would he explain this? And I'll go look for his piece of information. And I think that can be good and bad. I think that, if a piece is published in a reputable publication, then I should give them the benefit of the doubt that they do understand. But at the same time, I come from a background in Russian politics, and that means that political science, and that means that I would write specifically about Russian political science and culture. I wouldn't talk about Russian political science and the economy. I mean, I don't know anything about that, for example. So I like that people are able to specialize now, and that the thing that I like the most is that people are able to specialize, and that there's just a lot of demand for more words and more writing. And I think that that's just so cool that you can still make a living and people love to read what you're writing about crypto, even more now than ever.
So curveball question for you both. I'm not going to direct it at either one of you. I'll just let you jump in. Recently we've seen a few incidents where stories have been written that have incited a response from the subject of the story. And legal action has been taken, and there's questions around the integrity of the reporting. This is not new to journalism. This happens all the time, right? And so I just wonder, in a space as I'm not even going to say nascent. I don't think we're nascent anymore, but we're definitely still in that maturing and growth phase. How does that type of activity, or those kinds of rifts, impact the community and the perception from a media perspective? Do you think it's helpful or harmful?
Yeah, I mean, I can offer an opinion here. I mean, I think one of the issues and one of the reasons why we set up this group is because journalists are often caught between a rock and a hard place when it comes to covering crypto, right? On one hand, there's an expectation, which I think is misguided within the industry, that journalists covering the space should be cheerleaders, right? We should be advocates, we should be boosters, we should do things that are good for Bitcoin. And I don't think that's the role of a journalist and a free press at all. Our job is to be critical. It's to uncover the stories that various people may not want uncovered. And then it's to really assemble the facts in a way that readers can come to their own conclusions, right? I think there's a very big misunderstanding of what objectivity in journalism means, both in crypto and now sort of society at large. Objectivity isn't everything we write is perfectly weighted in all directions. The objectivity principle is all about presenting empirical evidence so that readers can then draw their own conclusions. That's what we're talking about when we talk about objectivity. And so, I think on the one hand, you have the industry saying, well, you guys are not being supportive enough of the industry. And then I think on the other hand, you have those same folks then who have then skyrocketed into positions of great wealth and power, whether individually or their companies, then decide to do things that I think have a chilling effect and can stifle the role of a free and independent press. And I think in the long term, that's, ironically, that's not good for the industry, because
that's quite dystopian, isn't it?
Right. And I think what you end up with, if you're successful with this strategy, is you stifle the free press. You get a bunch of guys who are advocates and boosters for the industry, and you're going to end up with a much weaker role for journalism and information on the industry. And what that ultimately means is new investors and new people who want to get involved are not going to have a way of evaluating the health of the industry in any kind of useful manner, because all they're going to get is this kind of boosterism and positive coverage. And so ironically, the people who then say you're not being positive enough and therefore we want to sue you because we want what's good for the industry, their very action actually weakens and makes the industry far worse. I think everyone in this business is far worse off if you have a kind of a compliant press, and a press that just repeats press releases. That's not good for anybody.
Well, and Molly, so kind of extending on from that, is what's the line between content creation and journalism and news, right? So kind of the editorial versus advertorial line of divide. Is there a good way that we can delineate between the two, so that we can still have these positive stories on the content side that are developed for an intention, because everybody is trying to be commercial, and yet still have the integrity on the editorial side that news is news?
Well, I think as someone, I've been on both sides of it now, because I was in the newsroom and now I'm working on evergreen content, which are they're just entirely different things. And it's kind of like, it sounds a little cliche, but if you know, if you're reading a story, you should be able to tell if it's a press release that should say sponsored or if it is a news item. And if you can't tell the difference, then something has gone wrong along the way. And I think that actually one of the most interesting aspects that has come up with our community discussion with the ACJR is the role of press people, PR agents in the crypto space, because a lot of times they do see the media as being their mouthpiece, when that actually isn't the way that it should be. Because oftentimes they do send press releases and they are newsworthy and they're covered, but they, for example, will ask for corrections about changing the quotation to be more positive, things that a good journalist should not do, and for the most part does not do, all the ones that I know. And so I think that while there are definitely benefits to having, for example, content creation pieces, and when you say that, I'm using it to mean sponsored editorial content, which is what the majority of the big news outlets have at this point. It's clearly labeled. And journalism is that, well, I used to think that no one would read an editorial piece because it said sponsored. Why would you spend the time on it? But when I actually had to edit some for the first time about a year ago for Cointelegraph, they were really interesting. They could be funny, they could make jokes, they could use cliches because they didn't have, they were paid for, and they were honest about that. So I think that, using both of those things can actually, both of those things is in pure journalistic pieces, and then content creation can both further the space, as long as the content pieces are a little bit educational and not just blatant advertisements. Although if they're labeled as such, then that's what the company wants, and they can do that.
Oh yeah. Well, you guys, thank you so much for the time. Last question to you, kind of a multi-pronged question. What are you hoping to achieve in your first 6 months of what I think is a really important initiative? And how can people get involved? We have members. How can they get in touch with you? What are the next steps?
Yeah, I think we've already achieved a lot. One of the things we really wanted to do, and I think with any launch, right, is to make sure that there's a good product market fit. And I think if you hop into our Telegram, you can get there via acjr.network, which is the website. Click the link to the Telegram. We have over 300 folks, everyone who's in marketing, comms, journalism, and research in the industry are in there. You'll see lots of familiar names in there. And the chat has basically been nonstop since we started that group. And I think that indicates to us that, look, there is a lot of demand for discussion around the issues that we're convening. I think this subset of people in the industry really want to have dialogue with each other. And therefore, our group is in a good position to really continue and channel those energies in a constructive way. So number one, join the Telegram. Number two, sign up for our weekly email that Molly and Lee edit, highlighting the best work in this space that we've seen in the last 30 days. And then in Q1, we're going to finally open up for formal membership. So an actual membership application form that we will approve, and you will then get voting rights. It sounds a bit like a governance token, right? And you also send us money so that you can become a member. Those are all the kind of infrastructure bits that are going to come into play in Q1 and Q2, so that we start having a membership body that can start to elect and vote and do a bunch of things to move the organization forward. And lastly, in Q2 in May, I think around the time of all the big conferences like Consensus, we're going to hold our. Yeah, I think they've sent out emails saying they're doing it. I mean, virtually. So we're going to hold our first annual awards around that time. And that's when we'll be able to recognize the best work that we've seen over the past year. So, if you want to be a member, Q1, you can sign up. If you're a business, your corporation, you want to be involved and support this group, you can also take part as a corporate member or as a sponsor of some of these awards. So I'll leave it there.
Brilliant.
Sure.
So Molly, what are you looking forward to the next 6 months, other than your fantastic monthly newsletter, which I encourage everybody to subscribe to?
Yeah, I was going to say, definitely read the newsletter. Lee and I spend a lot of time on it each month. The other thing is that if you look in our Telegram group in the pinned message, or just scroll back, there's a Google Doc where you can propose ideas for more of our online meetups that we'll be having after the holiday break. And I just can't wait until we can have a real in-person conference, although I think that won't be very soon, but until then we can keep meeting on Zoom like this.
Brilliant. June, Molly, Jane, thank you both so much for joining me today. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.